Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, completely hidden financial shockwave that is literally rattling the very foundations of the automotive industry. If you follow auto manufacturing, there's been a ton of headline focus on EVs. But the real story? The hidden cost of the current EV pivot, it's playing out entirely behind the scenes. We're going to map out exactly what happens when massive top-level manufacturing plans suddenly change course and how those decisions create an absolute tidal wave of consequences down the line. Okay, let's dive right into this. 30 to 40%. Now, just think about that number for a second. That staggering figure represents the massive, short-notice shifts in OEM, original equipment manufacturer, volume forecasts that suppliers are facing today. Imagine running a highly calibrated manufacturing business, and suddenly, out of nowhere, your primary client changes their volume order by 30 or 40%, with barely any warning. That kind of erratic forecast shift is exactly what component manufacturers are staring down right now. Section 1. The OEM mix shift, rebalancing production. So what's happening is major automakers are actively adjusting their EV production targets. Instead of that relentless straight-line march toward pure battery electric vehicles, OEMs are actually taking a step back. They're rebalancing their manufacturing mix right back toward hybrid and internal combustion platforms. And this is a massive departure from the aggressive long-term electrification roadmaps that these exact same automakers were hyping up just a short time ago. The targets have moved and the entire powertrain mix is shifting dramatically. Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 2, the supply chain shock downstream impact. The contrast here is just incredibly stark. On one side, you have the assembly floor. The OEMs themselves, yes, they're adjusting targets, but they're actually relatively insulated. The real financial shock isn't being absorbed on the assembly floor. Instead, that shock is cascading directly down onto the Tier 1 and Tier 2 component suppliers, deep in the supply chain. The automakers make the pivot, sure, but the component suppliers, they take the direct hit. And this dynamic creates a very specific and, honestly, very dangerous financial reality for suppliers, known as stranded manufacturing capacity. This happens because these component manufacturers did exactly what they were supposed to do, right? They invested heavily to meet those aggressive long-term OEM electrification plans. They bought the land, they built the factories, they installed the robotics. But now, with stuttering volume commitments, they have massive amounts of capital tied up in idle, automated battery component lines. This is highly specialized tooling. It's completely EV dedicated. You can't just ask a multi-million-dollar robotic arm calibrated for battery cells to suddenly start assembling spark plugs overnight. It's totally stranded. Now, what's really interesting about this is a harsh reality summed up perfectly by this thought. The flexible buffer doesn't exist deep in the supply chain. I really want to let the emotional weight of that sink in for a second. When you're dealing with physical, heavy manufacturing, you cannot magically pivot when faced with stuttering volume commitments. Software can pivot in a day. Specialized robotics and battery component lines absolutely cannot. When those volume forecasts shift by 30 to 40% on short notice, the deep supply chain simply has no flexible buffer to absorb the blow. They are entirely exposed. Which brings us to the operational chaos in Section 3, margin compression and squeeze. Suppliers are currently facing a set of impossible logistics that are driving unprecedented margin compression and capital inefficiency across the entire supply chain. First off, suppliers are being forced to maintain dual production lines. Because OEMs are rebalancing toward hybrids and internal combustion engines, suppliers have to keep their legacy production lines running at full steam. Second, at the exact same time, they're managing heavily underutilized EV-dedicated assets that they built for a surge that has suddenly slowed down. And third, they are carrying the entire financial burden of that stranded manufacturing capacity we just talked about. So you have double the overhead, massively underutilized expensive assets, and plummeting capital efficiency. It is the perfect storm for an absolute margin squeeze. But there are ways to survive this, which we'll cover in Section 4, strategic risk mitigation, survival strategies. So the crucial point is that component manufacturers must deploy strategic risk mitigation frameworks right now to survive. First, they have to build frameworks to fiercely protect profitability against these volatile short-notice OEM volume forecasts. Second, they need agile strategies to navigate those 30 to 40% whipsawing volume shifts without breaking their operational flow. And third, they absolutely must actively manage the incredible inefficiencies of running dual lines, balancing the demands of legacy internal combustion production right alongside those underperforming EV assets. If you're an automotive executive, a component manufacturer, or a supply chain manager tuning into this explainer, I want to leave you with this high-stakes question. How is your organization protecting profitability while navigating unstable, whipsawing OEM volume forecasts? This EV pivot isn't just a story about cars on a lot anymore. It is a story about supply chain survival. The shockwaves are here. The question is, how are you bracing for the impact? Thanks for learning with us today on this explainer, and keep asking the tough questions.